Today I will be discussing the program towards the awareness on the strained relationship between social workers and indigenous communities. First, I will be discussing the goals and the importance of the program. One is to integrate indigenous social work practices to the mainstream or Western social work perspective. Second is to broaden the knowledge of social work practice from one-size-fits-all perspective to a more specific and holistic approach. And lastly, this program also helps towards the healing process in a stained relationship between social work practice and indigenous population. Today, I will be discussing the timeline of my study to better understand the program. First, the discussion of the Canadian history which created a big impact on what is happening in the present regarding indigenous communities. By learning this, we become more aware of the type of problem we are dealing with to help the future generations. The history explains the European settlement, which was accepted by the generous hospitality of indigenous communities. However, with the plan to colonize, the land has been tampered by the malicious intent of the settlers. The rise of the residential schools came to pass, and the children were taken from their homes, assimilated to European practices, while slowly losing their culture, traditions, and their languages. This leads us to the present situation. Indigenous peoples are renowned not just because of their hardships, but more importantly, due to their resilience. However, this does not take away the fact that the government, who is supposed to compensate for the wrongdoings and abusive actions towards the indigenous populations, still fail to make up for the past. This is presented by the systemic underfunding of the government, which can be illustrated by the educational funding gap in First Nations schools. As we can see in this chart, there have been an increase in the funding for both sets of schools. However, if you look at the difference between the funds for provincial and private schools compared to the First Nations schools, the gap also increased from less than $1,000 in 1996, then tripled the gap, leading to almost $3,500 by the end of 2010. Moving on with the underfunding in schools. Indigenous homes are also underfunded, especially on reserve houses. This leads to poor living conditions. Because of the Western standard of living, social workers are then sent to apprehend these children, sending them to foster homes and other care home facilities. In turn, the children are again separated from their families, repeating the 60s scoop history. This then leads to trauma and intergenerational trauma. Finally, working towards the future. The program addresses the funding gap while potentially providing a better training and a deeper knowledge for the future social work practice. This focuses to better understanding of the issue, which then leads to a better relationship. As a ripple effect, it can lessen the overrepresentation of children in out-of-home care, which finally brings us towards the path to truth and reconciliation. The targeted populations are the future and present social workers, the indigenous communities, group homes and foster care homes, as well as the indigenous children and their families. Some potential encounters would be issues regarding the lack of support from the government. It also requires an extensive effort to produce voices for change, plans to action, and movements. The process of integrating anti-oppressive social work practice to new social work students may take time, of course, because of the thorough consideration. And finally, there is also a possibility to be rejected by indigenous communities due to a prior knowledge regarding the strained relationship with social workers on top of their traumatic experiences. Thank you for watching and bearing with me. Please subscribe to my... I'm just playing.